Thanks so much. Sorry for the delay. Thank you for joining NAMI Maryland's 40th Annual Conference. My name is Linda Weinberg. I'm a board member of NAMI Maryland, and I'll be your moderator for the session today. This workshop is called The Myths and Truths of Teen Suicide and Substance Use Post-Pandemic, and it's presented by Dr. Kizzy Pittrell from Ross Counseling. You can read more about Dr. Pittrell, including her bio, in the digital conference program on the official conference website. Dr. Pittrell is going to explore the myths and truths of teen suicide and substance abuse during the pandemic. And she's going to review the biological and psychological risk factors associated with teen suicide and substance use, while also providing critical information on what while also providing critical information on what parents and caregivers need to know to better support youth during these difficult times. If this is not the workshop you intended to attend, please click the back button on your browser or click on the sessions button on the left-hand side of your screen. We'll be addressing questions at the end of the presentation. If you have questions as the presentation continues, please post them on the Q&A on the right side of your screen rather than the chat section. And we'll be reviewing the questions as they come in, and we'll answer them as we can. We're also pleased to offer closed captioning for this year's conference. Captioning is only available for attendees using a desktop. To enable captioning, please click on the CC icon below the display of our presenters at the bottom of your screen. Once you click the icon, the video displays will become smaller and you will be able to see the captions being generated underneath. If you have any comments, concerns, or technical issues, please post them to the chat and our technical assistants will address them. And now, Dr. Pittrell, we're very anxious to hear from you on this very serious subject.
Thank you. And thank you, ladies, both for working through the technical difficulties this morning. So I do appreciate you both for helping me with the PowerPoint. And good morning, everybody. I'm glad that you are here and that you are showing some interest in this topic by being here with me this morning to get some information about this topic. Maybe it's new information for some, maybe it's a refresher for some, but I hope that we can make this an enjoyable learning time while we're here to talk about the effects of teen suicide and substance use post-pandemic 19. I know when Linda read my bio, she mentioned that I am owner of Ross Counseling, which is a group practice that I have in Baltimore County, but also here on my PowerPoint slide, it says another company's name. So Strengthening Families, Building Communities is actually a program that I added on to my business in 2020. So it's a psychiatric rehabilitation program. And hopefully in the near future, I'll be branching off and maybe doing some other things underneath of Strengthening Families, Building Communities. In addition to that, I am also an adjunct professor at Anne Arundel Community College and also Baltimore City Community College. So again, I'm thankful that you guys invited me back this year to present. And I hope that you will get some valuable information from this session. So let's just go ahead and get started. I'd like to start with just like a nice little warm up to kind of get people, talking a little bit. I know we can't do too much interacting in the virtual world, but we can at least kind of, talk a little bit in the chat. So I do have a little poll. Actually, Linda, if you can advance my slide for the next screen, we can go right into my truth and false questions. So at this time, we're going to go through these questions fairly quickly, and just for the sake of time. And what I would like for you guys to do is to put in the chat if you believe this statement is true or false. So we'll start with the first one. Teenagers who talk about attempting suicide are doing it for attention, true or false? And you can just put a T or F in the chat box. Okay, see a lot of F's. Okay. All right. So actually, the response is true. Is true, and they need the attention. So there is something going on that's causing them to feel this way. So as caregivers, as teachers, as parents, as extended family, they need people to listen to. They need professionals that can help them. And so that statement is actually true. Next. I know. Yes, Laura, it is a little trick question there. All teenagers who are suicidal are depressed. True or false? All right, so I got you guys again. Sorry. This statement is also actually true, but the reverse is not true. So most people will experience times in their lives when they are depressed, right? But may not have any suicidal ideation. So I'm gonna start with my trick question. So number 3, suicidal people really want to die. There's no way to stop them. True or false? Yay, okay. Everybody got that right. So they are depressed and they need help. With help, they can feel better and have better or other solutions. The next one, talking about suicide will cause a student to attempt suicide. You guys got it? Yep. It's false. So it's just the opposite. Not talking about suicide could escalate the problem. So even thinking about it can make the person, thinking about it makes a suicidal person feels worse. So talking will help bring understanding. Talking about it can relieve any suicidal students that, I'm sorry, talking about it can relieve suicidal students and get them the help that's needed. So we want to be able to have them discuss this openly if they can. Okay. Next one, if a person wants to kill himself or herself, no one has the right to stop him or her. True or false? You guys got it. So no different than a person who's physically sick or injured or ill, we will want to help them. So someone who also is trying to navigate through a mental health crisis, we also want to be able to help them as well. Once a person is suicidal, they're suicidal forever. You guys got it. So we know that one is also false. Teens who are suicidal can go on to lead very productive lives once they get the help they need. The suicidal feelings may only, last for a limited period of time. So we know that people would not be suicidal forever as long as they get the appropriate treatment and resources that they need. And the last one, improvement following a suicidal crisis mean that the suicide risk is over. Yeah, you guys got it. False. So most suicides will occur within 3 months following the beginning of, quote, improvement, when a teen really has energy to put like the negative and morbid feelings and thoughts into effect. So again, as relatives, as caretakers, as teachers, we want to be very vigilant during this time of the young person's life. Okay. Awesome, everybody. So let's go right into what we are talking about today. You can advance my slide 1. Okay. So what is it? What is teen suicide? So again, I think for many of us, again, this is probably information that we've heard before and we've heard from other places. I think it's just important for us to really be able to identify the difference between suicidal ideation, and also the warning signs and the warning behaviors. So we know that suicide is caused by oftentimes the teen not being able to talk about his or her feelings and also not being able to seek help. However, there are other factors that could influence the suicide, such as trauma, such as low self-esteem, such as poor academic performance, such as family stressors. So all of those factors can actually influence a potentially suicidal young person to now try to have more serious thoughts of killing themselves and actually trying to commit the act. But we definitely want to pay attention and be vigilant of those warning signs, and also be vigilant of those factors, such as family stress, such as school stress, such as any type of trauma that the young person might be experiencing in their life. You can advance the slide for one. Warning signs. So warning signs are very important to be mindful of. I know that these can vary from individual to individual. And so, and then we may see much of this in individuals, and sometimes we may see some of these warning signs in individuals. So again, I guess I can't stress enough as parents and caregivers how we need to just be mindful of some of these warning signs, and just kind of pay attention if we see the changes in the young person's behavior and their mood. So some things you might see that may be different, especially if you have a young person that's not normally, excessively sad or excessively moody. If you see more intense feelings of sadness and moodiness, and especially if those feelings are ongoing, that is a red flag for, the individual, maybe even, having some thoughts that just aren't negative thoughts, or maybe just having some built-in feelings that they're not really ready to talk about. But we definitely want to check in and just pay attention to like the changes of their mood. If they're looking at life like, very dark and negatively, if they're having a very grim outlook of their future, not really so hopeful of things happening in the future, and again, especially when we have young people who we interact with who normally are, don't have those negative thoughts, or they probably are, just like we consider, I guess, our kind of average young person, and I'll get into that later on in this presentation, that, there are different stages of development that we know young people go through where they can experience these symptoms that are considered normal. But what I'm talking about more specifically in terms of these warning signs are those symptoms that are a little bit more extreme, and those symptoms that last a little bit longer. So we know those things aren't always normal. When a person is always feeling sad and always feeling pessimistic about things and having these negative feelings and thoughts. If their sleep pattern changes, either sleeping too much or not sleeping enough, staying up, way into the wee hours of the morning and complaining of difficulty sleeping, only receiving like 1 to 3 hours of sleep per day, we want to definitely be really, really vigilant of that. Sudden calmness. So then if the individual appears to seem like everything's okay, like this out of nowhere, everything's okay, they're just so compliant, kind of go with the flow, what has changed? What has changed with this person? So that would be my first question. What has happened? And what's happened in their lives? Like what is the, where does the sudden calmness, where is it coming from? And I'm not saying that we want children to be like non-compliant and not following rules. We definitely want them to be compliant and following rules. But in this instance, talking about how they may go from the extreme of feeling very moody and feeling very sad to just like this sudden calmness and everything's going to be okay. And they're just kind of, going with the flow with everything. When they withdraw from activities, when they withdraw from family, from friends, from things that they once enjoyed, that is a huge red flag that we need to be aware of and pay attention to. Any changes in a person's personality or their appearance. So if you notice, like if the appearance start becoming, very unsheveled or disheveled or just kind of dark, individuals may look like they're unkept, like they're not taking care of themselves properly. That is definitely something important to note when working with young people. Any dangerous behaviors. So making statements that could be alarming. Things such as, maybe I'll be better off if I wasn't here. My family wouldn't miss me anyway if I wasn't here. So sometimes when, young people make those statements, I think that when we think of suicide, we oftentimes think of the extreme, which we should. We think of an individual going out to commit the act, and we should think of that. But there are also other red flags that come up, and even those statements are negative red flags that come up for us that we have to be vigilant and pay attention to. If the young person is also engaging in any type of dangerous behavior, such as, going out joyriding without wearing a seatbelt, or engaging in drinking and driving, or even hanging around people who might, we might consider to be very sketchy, or people that may not always comply with the rules. Those are also things that we, need to pay attention to within our young people. So again, making those unsafe statements and even engaging in activities and behaviors that will be deemed to be unsafe and harmful. Recent trauma. So it's important that we know what's going on in a person's life. Has there been any recent trauma or any type of family life crisis, any type of major decisions that has affected the family, and as a result affected the young person as well. Making preparation. So we know that this is a very common warning sign for a lot of people, when people tend to start giving away things and writing goodbye letters, and again, appearing, sometimes even during this stage, appearing still very calm, like things are okay, but their actions aren't really, making sense. They're giving away things that mean a lot to them. So we oftentimes see this a lot with not only young people, but also with adults as well. And of course, the very obvious threatening or, severely talking about hurting oneself is definitely a major warning sign that we have to pay attention to. You can advance one, Linda. What you may see. So what I want to just say is that, again, the warning signs that I just went over, and as well as, these signs that I'm going to go through right now, are all things that, we have to, try to see before, the young person is in serious trouble. So again, some things are going to be very obvious, like example, giving away possessions and personal items that have meaning to them. That's a very obvious thing that a young person might do. But some things that might not be so obvious is when a young person is acting very secretively, like if they're, not really talking much, not really engaging much, you don't really know what's kind of going on in their personal life. They're not sharing like what's going on in school, maybe not even sharing about, friendships. So when a young person becomes very, secretive, that is definitely something that we have to pay attention to. They're pulling away from their families, again, pulling away from family and friends. So again, isolating and withdrawing from those people that are important to them. And here's a huge one. When the young person has now started joining, with these group of friends or people that they know who, may not be, the best individuals to kind of hang out with. So these individuals may engage in risky behaviors. And I think the question then becomes like, why is this young person now, separated from their old group of friends and now joining with this new group of friends that, we may question some of the behaviors and even those friend groups. So that's another one that, teens may begin to show some signs of just kind of moving away from the friends they once had and once knew and hung out with to now this whole new group of friends. Grades starting to decline, so the academic performance, changes in their attention to their hygiene and appearance, and then, of course, dropping out of activities that they once enjoyed. Next slide. So I always like to definitely talk about mental health disorders, because we know that suicide can be the result of an individual having a mental health disorder. And in fact, having certain mental health disorders can increase the likelihood of the suicide potential. And so when we have individuals who do have diagnosed mental health disorder, we definitely have to consider that potential to be of high likelihood. And that's not to say that that's the case with everybody, but it is, the potential is definitely there. So some of the major disorders that, you would see that, again, increases that likelihood of suicide risk is major depressive disorder. So that's one where the individual, constantly has ongoing, intense and persistent feelings of sadness and loss of sleep, loss of, changes in appetite. I'll say changes in sleep, changes in appetite, loss of, energy, motivation, low self-esteem, all of those things that all of those symptoms are major, red flags and symptoms of MDD. And then bipolar disorder is just on the opposite end, where the individual now has this, inflated mood. And typically when they have this inflated mood that we call mania, the individual potentially can engage in more high risk impulsive behaviors, which then can become a potential for someone having those thoughts of death and dying. The individual who, when they're in that mania stage, they may not feel like they need sleep. So there's a reduced need for sleep there. There's this high energy, there's this loss of any kind of touch with reality. And of course, that high impulsivity. So they're very impulsive during that time. And as I said before, it could be a potential gateway to someone having more increased feelings of wanting to harm themselves. BDP. So I'm sorry, I skipped one. PTSD disorder. So post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, individuals who have endured and suffered various forms of trauma, or even sometimes even a single traumatic event, can cause someone to develop PTSD. And the symptoms that can go along with it: hypervigilance, someone very overly sensitive. Also, depression and anxiety are very, very high for individuals who have PTSD. And once again, is that same high potential for an individual to have those thoughts of death and dying. Borderline personality disorder, BDP. So we know that disorder is often characterized by an individual having very intense and unstable moods, and also unstable relationships. Many times this disorder is a result of ongoing childhood trauma. And so individuals, again, with BDP oftentimes, again, will have those thoughts of death and dying as well. Schizophrenia, where the individual has that inability to have any kind of touch with reality. So they, rotate between having hallucinatory and delusional thoughts and behaviors. Again, their thoughts could be very disorganized, and their behaviors can be out of touch with reality. Anxiety disorder. So we know there's a group of those. There's agoraphobia, there's claustrophobia, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, and also PTSD can also fall under the category of anxiety disorders as well. And then we have our category of eating disorders with anorexia and bulimia. So individuals who binge and purge or limit their food intake. So they struggle with maintaining appropriate body image and body weight, and oftentimes they have a higher risk of that potential for death and, having thoughts of death and dying. And finally, substance use disorders. So individuals who engage in alcohol use and drug use, which leads to all kinds of problems at home, at work, at school, issues with their family and their friend groups. So this is also a huge red flag for individuals to have those thoughts of death and dying when they're engaging in risky substances and substance use behaviors. Next slide, please. Okay. So I talked about a lot of the warning signs of suicide and some of the risk, some of the major categories of mental health disorders that increases the likelihood of one, having those thoughts of death and dying. So now I want to talk about just some other risk factors that we look at. Again, we talked about just mental health disorders, so teen depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders. Bullying and cyberbullying has become a huge risk factor for teens, because it, a lot of, especially in today's world where everything is virtual. I apologize. I believe that's on my end. I'm going to see if I can move to another area of the house, because it sounds like somebody's outside doing some work. So I was not aware that they would be, but I'm going to try to continue to talk. It is actually on my end. I thought I was in a safe place here to have this presentation, but I guess my neighbors had other plans. So I'm gonna try to move into another area, but I'm gonna continue to talk through the presentation. So just bear with me, please. I do apologize. Okay, so maybe this may not even be the best place. We'll try to get through it. Okay, so in terms of the risk factors, I talked a lot about the disorders in terms of the mental health disorders, but I think I was talking about bullying and cyberbullying. So bullying and cyberbullying has become a huge ordeal, we know, in our society, and I think a lot of that even was happening before the pandemic. And so, and bullying can be, as we know, in the form of direct verbal contact, indirect behaviors, gossiping, threatening, all those different things can, are bullying. They're all forms of bullying. Cyberbullying, of course, is when the individual goes into social media or goes into the internet and make just statements about individuals that aren't true, or gossip, or criticize individuals. I've even heard of stories where people get a hold of someone's pictures and kind of put those on social media. So those are all forms of cyberbullying. And unfortunately, it happens a lot. And it was happening for a lot of our young people even before the pandemic. I think a lot of this even increased during the pandemic, with children being home most of the day and having to do virtual school and interacting by virtual activities and things like that. So that all kind of falls under that heavy social media use. We talk also about economic stressors, so family stressors such as finances, when parents separate. And then there are those stressors in terms of single parents having to take care of a household and maybe not having the financial stability to do so. Family discord, which means individuals having the parental stress, parents going through divorce and separation and having to deal with that. Even having a parent with a substance abuse or mental health condition is a huge issue, in families. Trauma, be it sexual, physical, verbal, neglect, abuse, any kind of trauma, parental substance abuse, parental mental illness, poverty, financial, all of those can be forms of trauma. Even racial trauma. And we saw a lot of that during the pandemic when young people saw what was, all the events that were unfolding in our world with everything, right? Academic stress. So young people experiencing, issues in school, which could be a result of bullying or having, just kind of family issues that's affecting their school performance. LGBTQ youth. So this population, there's a huge risk factor for teen suicide within this population, just because of individuals, not being able to confide in families or friends about their orientation, being afraid to come out because of how they may be seen by family or friends, and bullying. These individuals receive a high rate of being bullied by their peers, and even adults can potentially bully LGBTQ youth as a result of their sexual orientation, and which also makes them feel reluctant to come out. History of sexual and physical abuse, low self-esteem, and of course, lacking that support from your family. Next slide. So what we're looking at here, I thought that it would be a great idea for me to kind of show you guys what the trends have been of suicide prior to the pandemic, before I talk about where things are now. So this chart just shows the trends of what we saw before the pandemic. And this looks at a pretty long time frame from 1991 through 2017. And just kind of the trend of what was happening. And the good news was that you saw a decline of teen suicide of those individuals between 9th and 12th grade who, again, were attempting suicide or had attempted or had suicidal, thoughts. So you actually saw a decline in the number of individuals who were experiencing those from 1991 until 2015. So that actually, was actually positive news. And I think that what the conclusions we can draw from that is that between the period of 1991 and 2015, we have more information in society about teen suicide and awareness and prevention and things we can do to help, teens when they're in crises now than we probably had in 1991. So that's on a positive note. Next slide. So this slide basically looks at the differences by race and origin versus Hispanic versus non-Hispanic youth. And it looks at looking at this is an older chart looking data from 2017. So we're looking at those individuals who thought about suicide, those who attempted suicide, and those who required medical attention. So that's the last chart there. So around that 2017 timeframe, we can see the highest group of individuals who actually had thoughts of serious suicide. So we see the highest group being the non-Hispanic white youth, with the lowest group being the non-Hispanic Black youth. And then those who actually attempted suicide, the highest group there was the non-Hispanic Black youth, and then those who required medical attention, again, the highest group was the non-Hispanic Black youth. From this, we can make a lot of the conclusions about probably why that has happened. Maybe there's changes in economic status, there's changing in family dynamics, maybe even changes in school and what's happening there, or even the increases of bullying and cyberbullying. So those are all kind of important things to note about why we're seeing these changes in the suicidal behavior among this population of youth. And then looking at differences by gender, again, is an older chart. So we're looking at prior to the pandemic, and some conclusions we can draw from this chart is that the first category, those who had the highest, I believe that's female. So females actually had the highest thoughts of suicide as opposed to males, and then with the lowest and even those who attempted suicide, females even were in the highest category. And a lot of the research I actually found in the literature as I was preparing this really did talk a lot about females having higher rates of attempts or suicidal thoughts as opposed to males. So some of the conclusions we can kind of draw there. What is happening with our female population? What's changing with females versus males? What are some of the challenges that females are trying to manage that are differently from our male youth and population? Next slide, please. And this looks at the differences by grade. So the 9th through 12th graders, what we can make references that they all had serious thoughts of suicide. They all had serious thoughts of suicide. However, in terms of those who attempted suicide, the highest the highest number was for the 10th graders, and then with the lowest being the 12th graders. Next slide, please. So again, I just put this here to just kind of give another little description of, kind of what the consensus says about these rates of suicide prior, to the pandemic. And I know we can't see it 100%. I can't even make it out 100%, even though I actually prepared this slide. But a lot of this information really focused on the adult population. I think the percentage that focused on adolescent was at the bottom where it says 60% of youth. So basically 60% of youth who they found who suffer from a major mental health disorder, such as like major depression disorder or another major mental health disorder, and they went without treatment, were the most, the group that was most impacted by either suicidal ideation or actually attempting suicide. Next slide. So here we get to some really interesting data. And I know I'm kind of giving a lot of data, but I want to just kind of show you guys the trends of what has kind of happened over the years. I tried to find another area of the house to go into. So let's just pray that whatever he's doing will stop shortly. So now we're looking at anxiety. So this looks at severe anxiety since March of 2020. So we know that the pandemic, I think for the most part, roughly probably was starting around January of 2020, but then the world kind of peaked in like March of 2020. And so what we see here, this was a study that was done of some respondents with anxiety disorder that talked about how much the anxiety peaked during the time of the pandemic. And this was actually at the height of the pandemic in March of 2020. And you can see the steady incline from March up until September of 2020. Next slide. Same thing with depression. We see that in March, 91% of individuals reported, the highest level, like between March, April, May and June kind of went down a little bit, then peaked again around July. And then right around August and September, kind of decreased by 1 or 2%, but not much, right? So again, some conclusions we can make from this is like what was happening, the thing that I would look at and what is happening with not only the individual and those individual factors, but also globally, because there was a lot that was happening in the world globally during this time. So that also could be a huge possibility as to why individuals began to, peak their depression level and anxiety levels really peaked around certain months of the year as opposed to other times of the year during that pandemic crisis. Next slide. And this looks at the percentage of individuals who reported having suicidal ideation more than half or nearly every day. The period goes from 2015 to 2020, but I really want to focus on the green line, which is 2020, and how individuals, again, their suicidal ideations really did peak around this time between September, October of that year. So again, some conclusions we can make, what is happening in our world, what is happening on the individual level. We do know that there was a lot that was going on globally in our world, that individuals were impacted as a result of some of these major global events and even these individual life-changing events that was happening with individuals. Next slide. So now I want to get into a little bit about some socio-emotional development of children and adolescents. So we know that in our developmental years, there's a lot that's happening, especially with our young people. There's a lot that's going on as they're developing, right? Erik Erikson, who was a researcher and educator in the field of psychology, talked about these stages of development, right? And so his focus of the adolescenthood years, he called that the crisis years. So he's looked at the crisis between identity versus role confusion. So he said during those years, young people went through this period of a crisis versus identity and their role. And so some of the things that we see within the adolescent time frame and that period are some very important parts of development that may explain why our young people do engage in some behaviors that we consider to be very impulsive or risky, and that could lead to other areas. So again, adolescenthood we know can be a very challenging time, especially for parents. We know it's a very challenging time for them. And so some of the things that Erik Erikson pointed out was the adolescent egocentrism. So during this period of adolescent years, adolescents have this sense of, you know, no one understands me. No one, I'm pretty much unique. No one has been through these life experiences before, besides myself. So they have this sense of egocentrism where it's all about them, right? There's not a whole lot of thought about consequences or maybe even empathy. I often, when I work with when I work with younger children and adolescents and had to do a lot of family therapy, I've always talked to my parents about, sometimes we have to teach empathy with our young people, especially when they are in those adolescent years. We have to teach, and teach them by way of showing them what it means to be empathetic. But during this adolescent period, sometimes they have no sense of that. Then there's the imaginary audience. That's where young people feel like whatever they're going through, their behavior is being watched. Like they're just actors on a stage, and their behavior is constantly being watched and judged by their peers, by their parents, by their teachers, by whomever. And then they experience this personal fable. So they feel like no one has ever done this before. I don't know how many parents I have on a call, but I can't tell you how many times when my daughter was like 16 or 17, and it was like, oh, well, how do you know? You've never done this before. Your friends weren't like my friends. Like they have no idea about experiences. Like their experiences are unique to them, and no one has ever thought or felt how they feel. And the last part of this developmental stage, he calls the illusion of invulnerability. So this is where young people think like, misfortune doesn't happen to me. It only happens to other people. And as I always explain to parents, this might be the reason why adolescents do engage in some high risk behaviors and things that are unsafe, because they don't feel like they can get consequences, like they'll have consequences as a result of their behaviors. Next slide, please. Oh, you can skip the slide. I'm sorry. That was a video, but I'm not going to show that one. So I know we talked a lot about suicide, looking at trends, looking at research and data, but how does suicide and substance abuse kind of coincide? Because we know that as one of the leading risk factors for suicide, the individual can have a substance use disorder that can actually increase their potential to become suicidal, right? So some of the substance abuse risk factors that we look at in young people, in terms of, maybe what is happening to lead them into the life of alcohol and drug use. Sometimes the behavior is very socially accepted in the home. Sometimes parents are just uninvolved with the teen. So the teen is now free to kind of do whatever he or she wants to do. Sometimes the peers are engaging in substance use. There's tension between the parents. There can be low self-esteem. The child has a mental health disorder. And again, it's that thought of that illusion of invulnerability, where individuals think that misfortune doesn't happen to them and nothing can happen to them. Next slide. So we know that drugs do impact a lot of different things with young people and with adults, but more specifically with young people. The drugs do play a huge part on its impact of the brain, because what drugs do is it impacts that reward pathway of the brain. So the substances actually flood the brain with dopamine, the same feelings that we experience when we have some relaxation or some release from stress. Substances impact that part of the young person's brain, causing those same types of pleasurable experiences. So dopamine causes that pleasure, and its real job is to continue the survival related behavior like sleeping and eating and encouraging pro-social behaviors. Alcohol and drugs increases that dopamine in the teenage brain, and what happens is overrides the natural and healthy messages of the brain. When young people become, when they socially experiment, or even when they are addicted to substances, that it is actually overriding those healthy messages that the brain sends to us. Next slide. So how do the brain respond to the substance response on the brain and vice versa? So there's a few different ways this happens. First, stimulants. So stimulants excites or speed up the brain and its function, and it causes that person to have that increased energy, faster breathing, heart rates increase, body temperature increases, all of those things that, again, it speeds up a lot of the functions of the brain. And then depressants does the opposite. It inhibits or slow down the brain and the body. So it causes more lower energy, lower, breathing, slower heart rate, and even body temperature. And hallucinogens just impair the brain, because what they do is that they cause this perception of reality that's not really reality. So they can cause delusional thoughts and very bizarre emotions and experiences to sights and sounds and tastes that are not necessarily real. Some of your stimulants, well-known stimulants that you probably have heard about or read about or seen, like your amphetamine, methamphetamine, Concerta, Ritalin. Some of the depressants are your like Zyprexa, Seroquel, Haldol. Those are all your depressants, and well-known hallucinogens would be like your LSDs and PCPs and things like that. Okay, so a few different things. So the adult brain and the teenage brain are very different, right? So I want you to think of the adult brain. For just kind of imagine an adult brain for a second. And the adult brain is covered and protected by a fatty substance called the myelin. So the myelin is a barrier. The X is a motorway, right? So think of the myelin as a motorway that prevents cars from going in and on and off the road, or animals from crossing the road. So the myelin actually makes messengers, the communication messages in the brain move faster. It helps signals messages. It helps the messages go into the right direction. However, that's a healthy adult brain. However, with a teenage brain, the teenage brain is not protected by myelin. So what happens when we remove, so think about again that same motorway. When we remove the motorway, cars can go off the road, they'll go in different directions. That is how the teenage brain will receive messages and send messages to the brain. So again, it's very, very different from the adult brain. And as a result, teens experience more intense sensation of pleasure or negative emotions than adults do, because the brain is not developed as the adult brain is, as we pretty much already know, right? So that is why teens often engage in more risky behaviors like alcohol and drug use. And they're also more sensitive to the effects of substance use as a result of their brain not having the same protection as the adult brain. Next slide, please. So what are some long-term effects of substance use? What we see in young people: liver damage, heart problems, this idea called, the quote unquote beer belly, physical dependency, cancer, emphysema, blackened or yellow teeth, impaired problem solving, difficult with memory recall, disruptive and chronic and even persistent lack of motivation, and also an increase in mental health disorders. Next slide. So what is the link, right? So real quick, as it looks like I'm running out of time, I apologize. So the link between all of this is that alcohol and substance use is a key risk factor for suicide in adolescents. What we know is that suicide is the third leading cause of death among teens, the first two being car accidents and firearms. So substances enter the brain, giving the teen the high feeling that they're seeking, and then consistent drug use over time can change the brain's chemistry. And what's the link between, again, suicide and substance use? So substances require the person to have physical dependency. So the body begins to now crave the substances. After a period of time, that leads to dependency, where the person will now be dependent on the substance to provide them what they need, what the body needs. Dependency can lead to feelings of depression, and teens often report high levels of irritability, hopelessness, helplessness, typically after the high wears off, which can result and lead to suicide. And then access to drugs may provide a means for teens to commit suicide. So what happened during the pandemic? We saw a lot of social isolation from family and peers. There was the increase in virtual learning. There were income changes. So basic living needs and livelihood decreased. We saw an increase in mental health. We saw an increase in intimate partner violence, child abuse, sex trafficking, substance use. There were barriers to access for youth supportive services such as housing, food, medical care. And there were also barriers to medical needs and vaccinations. What I didn't add on here was that there was also a high level of COVID-related deaths that impacted a lot of families. This is kind of look at the teen rate of suicide during the pandemic. So I'm just going to point out a few things here because I know we're kind of running, we're running close to our time. So what I indicated earlier was that what I indicated earlier is that teenagers, girls, females, oftentimes experience more suicidal ideations and attempts than boys did. And so between February and March of 2021, the number of ER visits for suicide attempts for girls were at 50.6%. For girls between ages of 12 to 17, compared to that same year, to the time period of 2019. For boys, those attempts rose by 3.6% during the early months of 2021. Emergency room visits increased by 31% among adolescents, with higher crises among girls. Again, so we see that higher crises among girls. And then overall, suicide rates for young people between the ages of 10 and 24 increased over the last decade. So what we saw was that the pandemic showed just higher rates of mental health and issues such as anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and self-harms. Next slide, sorry. Post-pandemic, so where are we now? I would say that one, I guess my question would be, I know that we use the term post-pandemic, but are we still even in the pandemic, so to speak, to a certain degree, right? There's been so much that's changed during this time frame. I think so many people are still struggling and still trying to navigate through a lot of things that happened to them and to their families during that time. So what we have seen on a positive note is that mental health treatment and services have increased overall. There's been more heightened awareness of mental health and teen suicide as a result of, families being more aware, families spending more time together, families, having more open discussions around this topic. So that has been very, another positive part that has come out of this pandemic. There's also been a lot of increase in programs to aid and to address, issues affecting teens, things such as mental health first aid and a lot of other various school-based programs to help address and prevent, teen suicide and actually talk about some of these risk factors and warning signs of teen suicide. And I think the last most important piece is that it has built some level of resiliency and strength in young people to kind of manage through tough situations. I know that, again, many have still been they still struggle with a lot of issues, be it family, be it school. But many people have built some level of resiliency and some kind of strength as a result of going through this experience that we all had to, go through. And to a certain degree, many people are still trying to navigate through this post-pandemic era. Next slide. So this slide is pretty light. I'm not sure if you can see it all, but it just gave some tips and information on how we can help our teens. So information is important, is valuable. So talking to our teens about drugs and suicides and having that information very, available, being able to be very open, having resources, having other support systems there to help continue the conversation, because it needs to continue. We need to continue to talk about these things, because just because, we have different ways to address the coronavirus now with vaccinations and things like that. We don't see so many people being hospitalized or dying as a result of COVID-19. Those other issues are still very prevalent. Those other issues such as drug abuse and suicide, they're still very prevalent. So we still have to provide information. Communication, being able to be open and communicating with our young people, showing that we're interested in their activities, showing that we're interested in their lifestyles and what they're doing, that we're interested in school, that we're interested in them, being able to spend time together as a family and being able to have those discussions. Listen and observing. So that goes along with communication, just being mindful and vigilant of what we see, and then questioning those things that, we might not understand that's happening to our young people. Being able to reduce our own emotions. So when our teenagers bring up things to us that, may sound, just kind of like weird or just, interesting, being able to not have a direct emotion for that, because our teens are looking at us. We're modeling behavior for them. And I think for many parents, they tend to, when a teenager brings some information to them, depending on how we respond and react to this information, will determine if our teenager will be open to share that information again with us. So being able to reduce our emotions to certain information that we might hear. Asking questions if we're not sure. So being able to ask questions if we're not sure about something. Showing our concern for what's happening in their lives. As I said earlier, being interested in what they're doing in school and out of school, being interested in their friend groups, being able to encourage problem solving when they're going through something, being able to help them navigate through tough challenges and problems, being able to set limits if we have to. And then, of course, knowing who their friends are, knowing who their peer groups are and who they are associated with. They're all very important pieces to keep this dialogue going and to also continue to provide and receive the information that we need about these particular issues that are happening with our teenagers. Next slide. Oh, you can skip this slide for the sake of time. This was a video that I wanted to show. It actually kind of sums up mental health, suicide, and how the importance of community. I guess for the sake of time, I won't have time to show it, but the information is there. And I provided some resources here as well to help teens and help families to kind of navigate through this tough conversation. I guess at this time, I'll entertain any questions or comments. Words matter. I'm just looking in the chat. Okay.
We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
The first one is, how does teen use in someone who also had an undiagnosed schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, damage into adulthood, someone who still uses heroin on occasion? So in other words, I guess there was a teen who used substances as a young person and now is in adulthood and had undiagnosed schizoaffective issues. So
they've used substances as a teen and they now are diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder.
Correct.
Okay. And the link is, I guess the person's asking like what? I'm sorry. It was like a really loaded question.
Yeah, they want to know what type of damage that would do into adulthood.
What type of damage does it do into adulthood?
Yeah.
So first, going back to the brain, of course, we talked a little bit about the damages there. So I'll say this. If an individual is using substances as a teenager, we know that it does cause significant damage to the brain. Many of the neurotransmitters, as we know, are important for sending information, for us to receive information. So it does damage in how that process it works. As I explained in my presentation, drugs also taps into that the area of our dopamine process, that pleasure field. And so instead of us, because there are things that we should feel happy about, and We get, happy sensations from when we're able to release stress. So we might hear a nice song or see a pretty flower or something. Those might cause feelings of happiness or, feelings of this kind of stability or security. But those are natural feelings that happens without the use of any type of substance, right? But when an individual does engage in substance abuse, especially as a teen, those substances attack the dopamine system, and then it causes it now causes the individual to experience like everything is now, they want to experience a pleasurable event or feeling for everything that they do. And it's not a real, is I don't want to say it's not a real feeling. It's not the same as if it's naturally like a natural feeling of pleasure and happiness, right? Also, just kind of going back to what I initially said, just about development overall, when teenagers use substances at an earlier age, it does cause issues and problems in their early development. Physically, how they develop, cognitively, how the brain is developing and how those chemicals are impacting certain receptors and processes of the brain. And even just emotionally, how an individual will develop. So I hope I answered that question as much as I could.
Okay, and we have one more question, which is, how does seasonal affective disorder add to youth and suicide?
So interesting. I did not see or have a whole lot of information on seasonal affective disorder in my presentation, but seasonal affective disorder does fall under the family of depressive disorder, major depressive disorders. So if we look at what the symptoms of major depressive disorders are, with the addition, of course, with the changes in weather and time, individuals who suffer from seasonal affective disorder, oftentimes experience those same feelings of depression, except it's heightened more during the winter months, right? And so I would say that as a result of just someone experiencing depression, it can definitely be a link to having untreated depression, especially if it's untreated. I'll say that it can definitely be a link to an individual, experiencing some thoughts of having, suicidal ideation and things like that. However, I don't want to say that that's the only, that people with depression will always think about suicide, because that's not true either. There are probably, if there are other factors that's impacting that individual, such as, stress or financial instability or family discord, all of those other factors definitely do cause, it's kind of like the person's placing a higher risk factor for potentially having suicidal ideation if they're already, trying to navigate through depression.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for today.
Okay.
If you have another question to the audience, please send it to connection@namimd.org.
I do have a comment.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I did have a comment.
Ahead.
I'm just looking at the chat and I see that,
yes.
I'm just reading. I don't know. Okay, yes. The Laura said that is, yes, die by suicide, not commit suicide. Absolutely. I do. Yeah, we have to definitely, and myself too, I get caught up, especially with kind of moving through this pretty fast and dealing with the noise. I probably did say commit suicide, so I do apologize. But I'm not sure what you're referring to as incorrect information in the session, because all this information that I presented is reference information. So there wasn't anything that was incorrect.
All right.
So, yes, I said substance use, not abuse.
Okay. All right. So you can also send questions at the end of event evaluation that'll be sent to you. And so if you would like to